The Duchess arrived dressed as a servant to meet her son's bride. What they said cost them. There is a particular kind of silence that lives inside grand houses. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of abandonment, but the silence of rooms that have held too many conversations, too many decisions, too many quiet moments where everything changed and nothing was said aloud. Eleonora Voss knew that silence well. She had grown up in it, in a house very much like the one she now owned. She had been married in it. She had raised her son in it. And on a Tuesday morning in the early days of October, she sat inside that silence and read a letter that threatened to break something she had spent 61 years carefully building. The letter was short. Friedrich had always been a man of few words even as a boy, while other children filled their journals with elaborate stories and drawings. Friedrich wrote in short, precise sentences as though he understood. Even then that the world responded better to clarity than to ornamentation. The letter said, "Mother, I have found the woman I intend to marry. Her name is Clara Ashford. She is not from our circles, but she is good. I hope you will trust me." Eleonora read it 3 times. Then she folded it, placed it inside the small lacquered box on. Helena had been with her since Eleonora was 42. She was a compact, precise woman with gray hair always pinned perfectly and a complete immunity to surprise. In 19 years she had never once raised her eyebrows at anything Eleonora asked of her. When the Duchess explained what she needed, Helena simply opened the wardrobe and began looking for something suitable. "The dark gray wool," Eleonora said, "with no embellishment whatsoever." "And your hair?" Helena asked. "Plain, back, nothing that would stand out." Helena worked for a while in silence. Then she said, very carefully in the tone she reserved for matters she considered important but would never presume to address directly, "Will Friedrich know?" "No," Eleonora said. Another silence. "Very well," Helena said. She asked nothing further. The arrangement required a letter sent through a third party, a solicitor who owed Eleonora a favor. He had been quietly hoping she would never collect. The letter explained that a reliable domestic worker was available for temporary placement ahead of a significant household event. It requested a position in the kitchen or laundry, provided excellent, but entirely fabricated references. The Ashford household, overwhelmed with preparations for the engagement dinner, accepted without hesitation. Eleonora arrived on a Wednesday morning carrying a basket of linens and wearing the expression of a woman who had done this particular kind of work her entire life. The cook, a stout woman named Mrs. Briggs, looked her over once and pointed to a room off the kitchen. "You'll help with the linens today and the table preparation tomorrow. Dinner is at 7 on Friday. The family expects everything to be right." "Of course," Eleonora said. She set down her basket and got to work. The house was, as she had expected, a study in careful management. Every surface was clean, every corner attended to, but there were signs, if you knew what to look for, of a household living just slightly beyond its comfortable means. The silverware was polished to perfection but slightly mismatched. The curtains in the main rooms were beautiful but had been rehemmed, the old stitch marks barely visible. The flowers in the entry hall were fresh and thoughtfully arranged, but they were garden flowers, not florist flowers. Someone in this house understood how to make modest things look considered. Eleonora found herself curious about who that someone was. She found out at 7:30 the next morning. Clara Ashford came downstairs earlier than anyone expected. She was dressed simply, her dark hair pinned without fuss, and she moved through the house with the particular quietness of someone who was accustomed to being the first one up. She paused at the kitchen doorway and looked at the 3 women working inside, including Eleonora, whom she had not met. "Good morning," she said, to all 3, with the kind of directness that was neither forced nor performed, just natural. I don't believe we've met.
I'm Claire.
Margaret, Eleanora said, using the name Helena, had suggested. A safe name, common enough to disappear into. Clara nodded and moved to the kettle. Has the flower situation resolved itself? She asked Mrs. Briggs. I know we were short yesterday. Mrs. Briggs explained that the delivery had finally come but that they were still managing the count carefully for the dinner. Clara listened, asked one practical question about whether it would be better to adjust the dessert quantities or the bread, deferred to Mrs. Briggs's opinion when offered, and thanked her before pouring her own tea and sitting at the edge of the table with a small notebook she had carried downstairs with her. Eleanora watched all of this. She watched the way Clara's pencil moved across the notebook, lists, practical lists, quantities, and timing and names, the work of someone who was not performing preparation but actually doing it. She watched the way Clara looked up when the youngest kitchen maid dropped a pan and startled herself, not with irritation, with concern. Are you all right? Clara asked. The girl, perhaps 16, blushed and apologized. Don't apologize, Clara said. Are you hurt? The girl shook her head. Good, Clara said, and returned to her notebook. It was such a small thing, and Eleanora could not stop thinking about it. The second day brought more. Clara's younger sister arrived mid-morning, a girl named Rosalind, perhaps 19, pretty and restless, and carrying the particular energy of someone who found domestic preparations deeply tedious. She snapped at one of the maids over a misplaced ribbon, not cruelly but carelessly, in the way that young women sometimes do when they feel the weight of other pressures and have not yet learned to contain it. Clara, who was arranging flowers at the other end of the room, set down her scissors without hurry and walked over. Rosalind, she said. Simply the name, nothing else. Rosalind looked at her sister, registered something in her expression, and turned back to the maid. I'm sorry, she said. That was unkind. The maid nodded. Rosalind retreated. Clara returned to her flowers. Eleanora, folding napkins in the corner, had seen the whole thing. She thought about Friedrich's letter again. She is good. The understatement of it. That evening, while the house wound down toward quiet, Eleanora was carrying a stack of pressed linens past the upper corridor when she saw Clara standing at a window at the far end of the hall. She had a letter in her hand. Friedrich's letter, by the look of the handwriting visible even at that distance. She read it slowly. Then she folded it carefully, precisely, along its original creases. And before she tucked it away, she pressed it once to her chest. Her eyes closed, her expression the particular combination of hope and fear that belongs to people who have found something they cannot bear to lose. She held it there for perhaps 3 seconds. Then she straightened, composed herself, and walked back toward her room. She did not see the woman in the gray dress, standing in the shadow of the corridor. Eleanora stood there for a long moment after Clara had gone. The corridor was empty and quiet. The candle in the wall sconce guttered slightly, in a draft from somewhere. She thought about a young woman staying up past midnight to stitch a tablecloth just to spare the household a small expense. She thought about a girl asking if the kitchen maid was hurt. She thought about a letter pressed to a chest in a private moment that no one was meant to see. And she thought, with a clarity that was unusual, even for her, that her son had not been careless. He had been, for perhaps the first time in his life, exactly right. But there was still the dinner, and there were still the Ashfords she had not yet met. The morning of the engagement dinner, Clara's mother arrived. Eleanora had heard her before she saw her. Margaret Ashford had a particular manner of entering a room that announced itself several seconds in advance. The sound of her voice, explaining something to someone, the particular clip of her footsteps on stone, the way the household seemed to tighten slightly in response. The way conversations became more careful and surfaces were checked one more time. She was perhaps 55, handsome in the way that women are sometimes handsome when they have spent their lives carefully curating every detail of their appearance. Her dress was the most expensive thing in the house by a considerable margin. She moved through the preparations with the energy of someone who had waited a long time for a moment like this and intended to extract every possible advantage from it. She inspected the table settings. She adjusted, too, of the flower arrangements. She questioned the cook about the menu with the authority of a woman who had not cooked a meal in 20 years but maintained firm opinions about how they should be done. She did not speak to the temporary staff, not because she was rude exactly, but because they did not register as relevant to her in any way that required acknowledgement. They were furniture, with function, present and useful and entirely beside the point. Eleonora watched this too. She watched Margaret pull Clara aside in the afternoon and speak to her in a low, urgent voice. She could not hear the words, but she could read the posture, the way Clara's shoulders straightened slightly under the conversation, the way she nodded at regular intervals in the manner of someone who has learned that nodding is the most efficient path to the end of a particular kind of exchange. She watched Clara, afterward, stand alone in the garden for 10 minutes before coming back inside and returning to her preparations with the same quiet steadiness she had maintained all week. Whatever her mother had said, Clara had absorbed it and set it aside. That steadiness, Eleonora thought, was perhaps the most remarkable thing she had observed all week, because it was not the steadiness of someone who felt nothing. It was the steadiness of someone who felt everything and had chosen, deliberately, not to be undone by it. Eleonora returned to the manor at 4 o'clock. Helena drew her bath and helped her dress without comment. The black silk, the family crest brooch, the strand of pearls her husband had given her on the morning of their 25th anniversary. She looked at herself in the mirror for a long moment. 61 years old, a widow for 9 of them. She had spent a great deal of those 9 years wondering what precisely she was holding the family name together for. Friedrich was competent. The estates were managed. The money was secure. But a name, she had always believed, was not just about money or land or connections. A name was about what a family actually was, what it stood for, in practice, in the small daily decisions that no one else would ever know about. She thought about a girl pouring her own tea, about hands that checked on a 16-year-old maid who had dropped a pan, about a tablecloth stitched at midnight. She picked up her gloves and walked downstairs to the carriage. She arrived at the front door of the Ashford house at precisely 7 o'clock. The butler, a nervous young man who had clearly been rehearsing this moment, opened the door and announced her. The room went still. Eleonora had experienced this particular stillness many times in her life, the stillness of a room, when someone walks in who holds a power that everyone present is acutely aware of. She had never fully grown comfortable with it, but she had learned to use it. She scanned the room in the way she had trained herself to do over decades, quickly, completely, reading every face. Friedrich, standing near the fireplace, looked at her with the expression he had been wearing since he was a small boy whenever he was uncertain whether he had done something right or wrong, a look that broke her heart slightly. Even now, Clara, standing beside him, had her chin lifted, not in defiance, not in performance, in the quiet self-possession of someone who had decided sometime in the past several days exactly who she was, and intended to remain that way regardless of what happened next. And Margaret Ashford, standing near the window, with a glass already in her hand, was watching the Duchess's entrance with an expression of intense calculation, working out angles, measuring distances, the expression of someone for whom This evening was not a celebration but a transaction. Eleonora filed all of this away and crossed the room to her son. "You came," Friedrich said quietly. "I always come," she said. "Eventually." He exhaled. She allowed herself one small, private moment of tenderness before she composed herself again and turned to be introduced. Dinner was good. The food was well prepared, a credit to Mrs. Briggs and the planning Eleonora had watched unfold all week. The table looked beautiful. The flower arrangements, which Clara had personally attended to, were simple and striking. The mismatched silverware was not visible unless you were specifically looking for it. The conversation flowed with the careful navigation of people who are all very aware of how much is at stake and very committed to not being the one who disrupts the surface. Eleonora spoke little. She listened. She asked 2 questions of Clara, direct questions about what Clara thought rather than what she knew, the kind of questions that could not be prepared for in advance. Clara answered them honestly, with a directness that acknowledged uncertainty where she felt it and confidence where she had it. Friedrich watched this exchange with the intensity of a man who understood that something important was being decided without anyone saying so aloud. The 3rd course arrived, and Margaret Ashford, who had been drinking steadily since before the guests arrived, leaned toward the man seated beside her, a cousin of Friedrich's named George, and spoke in the carrying voice of someone who had long since stopped monitoring their own volume. "Of course the Duchess approves," she said. "What choice does she have? Friedrich is nearly 32, and the Voss name needs heirs more than it needs another decade of him choosing incorrectly." The table did not go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave, one conversation stopping, then another, the way a room sometimes catches a sound that doesn't belong. Margaret, not registering this, continued. "Besides," she said, reaching for her glass, "Clara has always been smart enough to land somewhere soft, even as a girl. I always told her, watch the room, find the right door. She found it." She laughed, a short, satisfied laugh, the laugh of a woman who had said something she found privately funny and was mildly surprised that others hadn't caught up yet. No one else made a sound. Clara had gone very still. Her hands were flat on the table, pressing down lightly the way you press down on something to keep it from moving. She was looking at the white roses in the center arrangement, and her expression was the particular blankness of someone who has just been struck and is using every available resource to remain upright. Friedrich had drawn breath to speak. Across the table, George had become very interested in his fork, and Eleonora Voss set down her fork. The small sound it made against the china was the only sound in the room. She touched her mouth with her napkin once and placed it back in her lap. She did not raise her voice. She did not shift in her chair. She simply spoke, and the room, which had been waiting for something without knowing what it was, leaned in. "Mrs. Ashford," she said. Margaret turned, slightly surprised that she was being addressed, slightly flattered that she was being addressed, still not reading the room. "I have been in this house since Wednesday," Eleonora said. A pause, long enough to be felt. "I came without my name and without my title and without any announcement whatsoever. I arrived at the servants' entrance carrying a basket of linens. I spent 3 days working in this household as a member of the domestic staff." The silence in the room changed quality. It became the silence of people who are recalibrating a great deal of information very quickly. Margaret had gone completely still. "I came in that manner," Eleonora continued, "because I have learned over 61 years that you cannot truly know what a person is by observing how they behave when they know they are being watched. The performance that people offer when they know power is present tells you very little. What they do when they believe no one of consequence is watching tells you everything." She let that settle. Your daughter, Mrs. Ashford, treated a woman she believed to be a laundry servant with precisely the same courtesy and consideration. She has shown every person at this table tonight. Every morning she greeted the kitchen staff by name and made eye contact with each of them. When a young maid dropped something and was startled, your daughter's first question was whether she was hurt. When she prepared for this dinner, she stayed up past midnight, attending to details that no one would ever notice because she believed they mattered to the people who would sit at this table. Clara had looked up from the roses. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something that was holding tears in reserve. She did not do any of these things because she thought she was being observed, Eleanor said. She did them because they are who she is, and that Mrs. Ashford is not a woman who has found a convenient door. That is a woman who has spent her entire life making herself genuinely worthy of whatever door opens. She turned her gaze to Margaret fully. You, on the other hand, have just sat at a dinner table and told everyone present, including your daughter, that her value is strategic, that her love is calculation, that everything she is something she deployed. Margaret had gone the color of old paper. I came to this dinner prepared to have significant objections to this match, Eleanor said. I find that I have only one. The table waited. Eleanor looked at Clara for a long moment. Then she looked at Friedrich. Then she looked back at Clara. Welcome to the family, she said. You have more than earned it. She picked up her fork and returned to her meal. The room remained silent for another 3 seconds. Then George quietly cleared his throat and said something to the person beside him, and the table cautiously, carefully, resumed. No one spoke to Margaret Ashford for the remainder of the evening. She left before dessert was served. The days after the dinner were quiet in the way that days are sometimes quiet after a storm. Things settling back into place. A new landscape emerging from the rearrangement. Friedrich came to see his mother 2 days later. He arrived unannounced, which he had not done since he was 16. He sat in the chair across from her desk and looked at her for a moment with an expression she did not immediately recognize. Then she did. It was the expression of someone who is trying to find words for something that exceeds the vocabulary available to them. You were there all week, he said finally. Yes. And you said nothing to anyone. I was working, she said. There was quite a bit to attend to before the dinner. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, very quietly, thank you. Eleanor picked up her pen. She is good, Friedrich. You were not wrong. I know, he said. The understatement was somewhat significant. His mother said, you could have elaborated. He almost smiled. I didn't think you'd believe the elaboration. I wouldn't have, she said, which is why I needed to see for myself. He left an hour later. At the door he paused and looked back at her. She doesn't know, he said, about the 3 days. No, Eleanor said. Will you tell her? Eleanor considered this. Eventually, when it becomes a story rather than a wound.
Friedrich nodded.
Then he left. Clara told her mother she would not be attending the wedding on a Thursday morning 10 days after the dinner. She had thought carefully about how to do it. She had rehearsed various versions, all of which were longer and more careful than what she ultimately said. In the end, sitting across from her mother at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea going cold between them, she said simply what was true. You will not be at the wedding, Mother. Not because I want to punish you. I don't. But because I am done now arranging my life around your comfort at the expense of my own. Margaret, who had been preparing a different kind of conversation entirely, was caught entirely off guard. You cannot simply exclude your own mother from your wedding, she said. I can, Clara said. I have thought about it carefully for 10 days, which is longer than You thought about what you said at the dinner table. I have considered your feelings at length. I am asking you now to consider mine. Everything I have ever done, Margaret began, has been for you and your sister. Everything has been so that you could have what we never had. If I pushed, it was for you. I know you believe that, Clara said. And some of it may even be true. But what you said at that dinner was not for me. It was for you. It was you wanting to feel clever and important in a room full of people you had been trying to impress for 20 years. And it cost me something I cannot fully describe. In front of people I had only just begun to know. Margaret was quiet for a long time. I didn't know she had been watching, she said finally. It would not have mattered if she hadn't, Clara said. That is rather the whole point. She stood up. She picked up her teacup and Margaret's and carried them to the sink. I love you, Mother, she said with her back turned. But I am going to build a life now that looks like me, and I need you to understand that I am not asking for permission. She set the cups down gently and left the kitchen. Margaret sat at the table alone for a long time. Outside, a pale October sun came through the window and moved slowly across the floor. Friedrich and Clara were married in October, on a day that could not decide between autumn and winter, and settled on both. The ceremony was small, 30 people, a stone chapel on the edge of the Voss estate where Friedrich's father was also buried, where Eleonora had stood on cold mornings more times than she could count. Clara wore a dress that was not white but the color of winter cream, simple lines, no ornamentation, a single small braid worked through her hair. She had done it herself, with Rosalind's help, and it was not perfect, and she did not appear to mind. Friedrich, standing at the altar watching her come down the aisle, looked like a man who had just understood something he had been reaching toward for years and finally touched. Eleonora sat in the front row in deep blue, not black, which was what she wore when she wanted to project authority, not gray, which was what she wore when she wanted to disappear, deep blue, which was what she wore when she wanted to be simply present, herself, no more or less than that. When the vows were read, she did not watch Friedrich. She watched Clara. She watched the way Clara's voice held steady, even at the parts where voices sometimes don't. The way she looked at Friedrich, not with the performed adoration of someone playing a role, but with the particular quality of attention that belongs to someone who is genuinely, carefully choosing. She thought about a basket of linens at a servant's entrance, about a kitchen full of women greeted by name, about a corridor at night, and a letter pressed to a chest for 3 seconds, before the world could see. She thought about her son's letter, short, precise, the way Friedrich had always communicated the things that mattered most. She is good. Eleonora understood now that he had not been offering reassurance. He had not been apologizing for a choice he knew was unusual. He had been sharing something that he could not find a larger word for, not because the larger word didn't exist, but because good to Friedrich was the largest word there was. A person who is good without audience. Good in kitchens at midnight. Good in corridors where no one is watching. Good in the small, everyday choices that accumulate over a lifetime into a kind of character that no circumstance can unmake. The vows ended. The witnesses signed. Rosalind cried prettily and was handed a handkerchief by George, who had also been crying and was pretending he hadn't been. Friedrich kissed his wife. Clara turned, still holding his hand, and found Eleonora's eyes across the small chapel. She held her gaze for a moment. Something passed between them that was not a full conversation, but was the beginning of one conversation that would be continued, Eleonora understood, over many years, over tea taken in the morning, over disagreements navigated with honesty, over grandchildren and seasons and all the ordinary, extraordinary accumulation of a shared life. Eleonora gave the smallest nod. Clara gave it back. 3 months after the wedding, on a quiet evening in January, Clara brought 2 cups of tea into Eleonora's sitting room and sat down across from her mother-in-law. They had been doing this once a week. It had started as obligation and become, gradually, something else, something that neither of them had quite named yet. Clara set down her cup and looked at Eleonora, with the directness that Eleonora had first noticed in a kitchen doorway at 7:30. On a Wednesday morning, Friedrich told me, she said, about the 3 days. He said you asked him to wait until it could be a story rather than a wound. Eleonora looked at her. And is it? Clara considered this seriously, the way she considered everything, not performing thought, but actually having it. I think it is becoming one, she said. Eleonora picked up her tea. Good. I have one question, Clara said. Ask it. The tablecloth, Clara said. The one I stayed up to mend. You saw that? Yes. Why did that matter? Of everything you observed, why did that one stay with you? Eleonora thought about this for a moment. Because no one would ever know, she said finally. The guests would not know it had been mended. Mrs. Briggs already knew it needed mending. There was no audience for that particular effort. You did it because the table deserved a whole cloth, because the dinner deserved that care, because the people who would sit at it deserved not to look at a torn thing when something better was possible. She set down her cup. That is how I have tried to live my entire life, and I have not always succeeded, but I have always tried, and I had spent 31 years hoping my son would find someone who understood that without being taught it. Clara was quiet for a moment. And your conclusion? She asked. Eleonora looked at her with the particular expression that she reserved for things she considered settled. I found her, she said. Outside, January snow had begun to fall, quietly without announcement, the way the most important things so often arrive. And inside the house, in a sitting room, with 2 cups of tea and the accumulated quiet of a family that had just grown, by exactly one, something settled into place, not loudly, not with declaration, simply and completely, and in the manner of things that are meant to last. Some tests we design to confirm our fears, but sometimes, if we are honest enough to look, they confirm something else entirely. The Duchess arrived dressed as a servant. To find a flaw, she found instead a woman stitching a tablecloth at midnight, and understood at last what her son had been trying to tell her all along. Good. The largest word there is.